Hey family, Kelly here, and welcome to week 5 of the Book of Mormon study here in the Drakestone Aquarium. For 1 Nephi chapters 16 through 22, we'll discuss Nephi's rise to leadership and the parallels between Isaiah's call to flee Babylon, the flight of Lehi's family into the wilderness, and how we're called to flee evil in our lives. So sit back, relax, enjoy the tank, and let's chat. Before we get into the parallels, I want to start with a really good point Jediah made. As we were watching the church's new Book of Mormon videos, he said Nephi's broken bow and him building the ship were stepping stones to prepare Lehi's family to accept Nephi's leadership. I would add that it was also about preparing Nephi, teaching him to step up and take action to solve problems, rather than relying on the older members of the family to do so. We saw this when they went to get the brass plates from Laban, too. For their first attempt, they relied on Laman, the oldest and traditionally the future leader of the family, to take charge. When that didn't work, they tried offering the riches they had left behind. Neither of these conventional ways worked. Why? After all, as Nephi said, when the Lord gives a commandment, he prepares a way for them to accomplish it. So why did God keep letting them fail? For that, let's look at how the third successful attempt differed from the first two. First, Nephi stepped up to the plate. He took matters into his own hands, where before he was content to let any of his brothers take control, hence the casting of lots. Second, he was led by the Spirit. In fact, it appears that he really didn't know what to do, other than rely on the Spirit to guide him, and when faced with a difficult decision, namely slaying Laban, he obeyed the promptings of the Spirit rather than his own logic. The brothers didn't accomplish their task until they trusted in Nephi, and Nephi didn't succeed until he stepped up and took action on behalf of his family, trusting in God to guide him. We see this theme again with a broken bow in 1 Nephi 16. Nephi's bow breaks, everyone murmurs, and it becomes extremely difficult to get food, even for Nephi. Verse 21 says he was afflicted with his brethren. I don't know if that means he was afflicted just like his brethren were, or if his brethren were an affliction to him, like a bad case of Lamanitis. But the point is, while everyone else was suffering and murmuring, Nephi was suffering too. Once again, things didn't change until he stepped up to the plate and took on the leadership role. He made a new bow and arrow, he had his father consult the Liahona to tell him where to go to get food, and he followed God's directions. Only then did he return with food for the family. Nephi got more practice in the leadership role, and the family group once again saw that when you've got a problem, Nephi's the one you go to for solutions. Building the ship was a big step toward becoming a leader. This time, God didn't call on Lehi to charge his sons to complete this task, as he'd done with getting the brass plates and recruiting Ishmael's family. He called directly on Nephi. I don't know if the mantle of leadership had been formally passed to Nephi yet in the family's eyes, but it sure seems like God was starting to expect Nephi to fulfill that role. In 1 Nephi 17:53-54, we also see God giving Nephi the power and authority he needs to get his brothers to help him build the ship. And in verse 55, the brothers acknowledge that Nephi has authority from God, and they obey him. And then the ocean happened. In chapter 18, it seems the next step Nephi took toward becoming the leader of his family was that of being a prophet to his family, seeing spiritual danger and warning them before the dire consequences came. When he saw some of the family making merry, dancing and speaking with rudeness and forgetting the Lord, he took it upon himself to warn them. Laman and Lemuel rejected his counsel and tied him up. After that, a storm blew in, and the compass quit working. Now you'll notice that it wasn't storming when they were partying. The ocean was calm until they tied up Nephi. Then the wind started blowing them backward, and the compass quit working. After 4 days of this, Laman and Lemuel repented and untied Nephi, but even that wasn't enough. The storm continued to blow until Nephi prayed for it to stop. My fish flakes are that this was meant to be a powerful testament to the family of Nephi's role as the chosen go-between for them and God. When they mistreated God's chosen instrument, they did so at their own risk. And isn't it the same for us? When we disrespect or disregard the prophets, the Lord's mouthpieces, we do so to our own spiritual peril. Part of being a good leader is being an effective teacher. Nephi shares one of his teaching methods in the second half of 1 Nephi 19:23, when he says, "But that I might more fully persuade them to believe in the Lord their Redeemer, I did read unto them that which was written by the prophet Isaiah. For I did liken all scriptures unto us, that it might be for our profit and learning." As we explore chapters 16 through 22 in 1 Nephi, let's use his teaching method to learn how the prophecies of Isaiah and the experiences of Lehi's family in the wilderness apply in our lives. The first principle I want to focus on is in 1 Nephi 17:3. The message in verse 3 is that when the Lord commands us to do something, He also provides us with the means to be able to do it. He nourishes and strengthens us. In 1 Nephi chapter 20, verse 17, Isaiah puts it a little differently. He describes God as, quote, "The Lord thy God, who teacheth thee to profit, who leadeth thee by the way thou shouldst go," close quote. God will teach us how to succeed in the tasks He gives us, if we'll heed His word and His Spirit. We just have to remember that He doesn't always measure success the same way we do. Take a minute and think about what God has commanded you to do. It could be raising a righteous family, spreading the gospel, accepting a calling, family history and temple work, being a good example and influence to others, or committing ourselves to obeying the commandments more fully. It may also be working toward the next step on our covenant pathway, preparing for baptism, priesthood ordination, a mission, or temple covenants, or it could be helping our children or our loved ones prepare for those things. For those of us who've already made temple covenants, what are our covenants and what can we do to observe them? Something to run through your gills. As you consider your task, ask what tools God has given you to help you accomplish it, or what tools are available to help you with it. An important step that will aid us in every task we're given is the commandment we find in Isaiah's writings in 1 Nephi chapter 20, verse 20, to go ye forth of Babylon. In 2012, Elder Holland gave a powerful devotional on what fleeing Babylon means in our day, called Israel, Israel, God is Calling, which I linked below and highly recommend. Let's consider what Isaiah and the flight of Lehi and his family from a wicked Jerusalem teach us about fleeing the spiritual Babylons in our lives. In chapter 17, verse 40, Nephi teaches that God loveth those who will have Him to be their God. I think having Him to be our God includes choosing to trust Him no matter what happens to us, committing ourselves to obeying His commandments, and being willing to accept the consequences that come when we don't. Isaiah's parallel can be found in 1 Nephi chapter 20, verses 1 through 5. Isaiah describes the house of Israel as having come out of the waters of baptism, who swear by the name of the Lord and make mention of Him, yet they swear not in righteousness or truth, who call themselves of the holy city, but they do not stay themselves on the God of Israel. Have we done this? Are there times when we claim to be Christian, but we don't act the way Christ would have us act? Do we want the spiritual rewards God promises to the faithful without having to put in the effort required of us? Are we willing to accept correction from the Lord, or do we let negative consequences shake our trust in God or our faith in His existence? Choosing to trust God and act on our faith, regardless of the consequences, takes us one step away from Babylon. Once we decide we want God to be our God, how do we come to understand His commandments, expectations, and counsel for us, these things we're supposed to obey? In chapter 20, verses 16 through 18, we learn from the prophet Isaiah that a prophet sent from God speaks openly, not in secret, and if we heed the prophet's commandments, then we'll be blessed with peace and righteousness. The prophets are like the Baal or the Liahona that Lehi's family used in chapter 16, verses 28 through 29. The pointers worked according to the faith, diligence, and heed that the family gave them. If the family lacked faith or ignored the pointers, then they wouldn't be able to find their way. Same with the prophets. What good will their words do us if we're not listening, or if we listen, but then don't act on what we hear? On the other hand, living the principles they teach will lead us to the blessings and peace the Lord promises to His faithful, righteous followers. In chapter 16, verse 35, the daughters of Ishmael mourn the death of their father and their afflictions in the wilderness. They lose hope and murmur against Lehi and Nephi, their spiritual leaders. Chapter 21, verse 14, sounds as if it comes almost straight from their mouths. Quote, "The Lord hath forsaken me, and my Lord hath forgotten me." Close quote. There's such tenderness in the reply. Isaiah says God will show his followers that he hasn't forgotten them, comparing God to a mother who can't forget her infant. Yea, they may forget, the Lord says, yet I will not forget thee. Like Israel, or these disheartened women who've been through so much and don't think they can take anymore, the Lord hasn't forgotten us. Our trials aren't an indication that he's turned away from us. There are times when he steps back, either because we've pushed him away or because there's something we need to learn from going it alone for a while. But trust me, he's always there and he loves us. He's graven us on the palms of his hands. He didn't sacrifice himself for us just to give up on us. We're the ones who give up on him. And why do we give up so easily on the God who gave everything for us? Sometimes being faithful and obedient feels like a lost cause. Such was the case with Laman and Lemuel when Nephi called on them to help him build the boat. 1 Nephi 17:18 explains that they didn't want to help because they didn't think Nephi could build a boat, nor did they think he was instructed of the Lord. In other words, they wanted to see the results of their labor, the boat successfully completed, before they were willing to work on it, which is the opposite of faith. But before we go hating on them, let's remember that we do that too. This sentiment is echoed in Isaiah's writings in 1 Nephi 21:4. Quote, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for naught and in vain. Close quote. We all have times when we get discouraged. I struggled with that for a while. Between injuring my hands in 2019 and having little apparent interest in this channel after a year of hard work, I was seriously considering giving up. I thought, hey, I got the 4 Gospels up. I gave it a go and it's not working out, so isn't that good enough? I wanted to see the big results from my labor. But that's not how God works. Remember the second set of plates Nephi had to make that we talked about in week 2? He never saw the good that came of all that hard work. He went to his grave without getting to see the result of his labor. But I don't think Joseph Smith or anyone with a testimony of the Book of Mormon would call what he did a waste of time. We won't always see the results of our labor, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't work at it anyway. As we're waiting and waiting and waiting on God to see us through our trials or to show us the fruit of our efforts, we have to keep in mind 1 Nephi 21:8. Quote, Thus saith the Lord, in an acceptable time have I heard thee. Close quote. It might be that acceptable has some alternate archaic definition that changes his meaning here, but to me, this is a reminder that the Lord's timing is always right, no matter how much we wish he would move just a little faster. Take the appearance of the Lehi, for example. Lehi and his family moved out into the wilderness and settled there, while the sons went back for the plates and then for the ladies. In 1 Nephi 16:9, the Lord told Lehi by a vision in the night that in the morning they would take their journey into the wilderness. And then in verse 10, the following morning, Lehi woke up and found the Lehi waiting for him outside his tent. Here's the point. Lehi and his family were camped out in the wilderness for days, weeks, maybe even months, with no idea where the Lord would send them or how they would get there. God didn't let them know which way they would go until it was time for them to leave. He waited until the morning of their departure, when they needed to know how to find their way, to give them the tool they needed. Had I been in that party, I would have struggled with that. All that waiting with no idea what came next would have driven me crazy. But as frustrating as the Lord's timing is to anxious people like me, his timing is always the right time. As you read these chapters, what parallels do you find in your study? Share them below. And if you know someone who could benefit from this video, spread the fishy love. Next week, I'll share my observations about Laman and Lemuel's abusive and manipulative tendencies, the self-defeating cycle Nephi got caught in because of them, and what we can learn from his example and Lehi's counsel about how to overcome such tendencies and effects in our lives. Until then, enjoy your feast upon the words of Christ, and remember, we're all brothers and sisters in our Heavenly Father's family. We're in this together.